Welcome, everyone, to this Good Leadership Podcast. My name is Charles Good, your host and the president of the Institute for Management Studies. This podcast is designed to provide you with actionable insights and tools that you can use from discussing the research, stories, and background from recognized experts and practitioners to accelerate your impact in your current role. My goal is what we've discussed today will be immediately actionable and useful to you, and I'd love to hear your comments for this episode about what you're planning on implementing. Today, I'm glad to be once again joined by Dr. Rick Brandon, who has consulted, trained, and presented at hundreds of companies worldwide over the last 30 years. He authored the Wall Street Journal bestseller on ethical corporate politics called Survival of the Savvy, which has been called the preeminent book on the competencies of organizational and political savvy. He is also the president and founder of a globally respected consulting firm, offering workshops on interpersonal and political savvy. His courses are taught worldwide to many Fortune 500 companies, as well as government agencies, healthcare institutions, as well as educational ones. Thank you again for joining me today, Rick.
It's great to be back, Charles. I just realized it's been 20 years that we've worked together in these seminars. And so I'm not going to ask you for a Rolex, but it's great to be back, and always is a pleasure to be working with you.
Thank you, Rick. And last time when you were on the episode, we talked about your new book, Straight Talk, which was a great conversation on that. Today, I really want to focus on the international bestseller that you wrote, Organizational Savvy. A lot to unpack today. It's a great book. So before I start, love to just ask you a little bit about your background. And in regards to this topic, love to know what started you on this topic, because I've heard and seen it, we've talked about it, that you've kind of funneled data from 20 years of derailment coaching, right? With thousands of executives who either were overly political or under political into a framework in which you could teach on organizational or ethical organizational politics.
Exactly. That's straight on. If you think of influence, there's a lot of kinds of influence, and you got your substantive influence, your ideas got to make sense, interpersonal influence, which we talked about in the last podcast, Straight Talk. But there's also style-based influence, Myers-Briggs, DISC, all of that work. Presentation, you got to present yourself and have good presentation skills. But what I found after 20 years of teaching mostly in those areas, interpersonal and presentation, et cetera, nobody was talking about political influence, what I called strategic influence. And what we were finding, my co-author Marty and I of Survival of the Savvies, Marty Selman, that book, the origins came from what you just said, derailment coaching. It's not the kind of coaching you want to be in. It's the kind that you are in trouble. You're either being thrown out of the company, or if you hit a career plateau and a last ditch effort, they bring in a corporate coach. And what we found was that longer ago, to your point, it was 15 to 25 years ago. This is with 2,000 folks that Marty and I have coached in a derailment situation. Used to be longer time ago that it was the over political people who didn't have EQ, emotional intelligence, or care. They were abusive, and now they were so high they couldn't get away with it. So they were in trouble. But more recently, with the volatility and competitiveness and the turbulence and complexity of companies, just as many people in career difficulty up a creek without a paddle who were under political. They didn't have politics. They weren't abusive. They were too self-deprecating, and they were in trouble for the opposite reasons. Under political and over political is a problem. That's the origin. I said to Marty, why are we waiting until people are in trouble? Let's package this stuff into, as you put it, a cognitive framework for understanding what is your political style and what are the skills for not being in trouble by being over or under.
That's great. And really, many people think if you're politically savvy, right, that's kind of a dirty word.
Yeah.
That's something underhanded. That's something that you really don't want to promote, that you are that way. But your definition is a little bit different of that, because you're dealing with the ethical above board piece of that versus the darker side.
Bingo. Well, I like to joke, it is. It's not a joke. It's the dirtiest word in the English language, and people throw the baby out with the bathwater because they only view it. Their self-talk is it's evil. It's as if they're defining it in the two Greek root words. Do you know that one? Poly means what?
Many.
Poly, yeah. And tix means blood-sucking parasites.
Oh,
So
quite literally.
not really, but
It
what we're
works.
trying to do, yeah, we're trying to change people's self-talk so they don't throw the baby out with the bathwater and live in the river in Egypt, the Nile, and get into career trouble. So we define it as strategic influence. We're really, that's the first step, is to redefine and to look at your attitudes and your negativity about politics and to try and reframe it as strategic influence. It's really just trying to get more visibility for yourself, more greater influence for yourself, to get into a position of power, but not power tripping, positive power to do great things for the company and to do what we call impression management. So even in political parties, this is about company and agency politics. But if you think of government politics, it's about image management and visibility and impression management. So all that politics are in organizations are efforts, sometimes behind the scenes, to understand the unwritten rules, to gain visibility and endorsement, and to sell your ideas and achieve positive power to do great things for the organization. That's ethical politics. And I love what you said. It's high integrity politics. It doesn't have to be Darth Vader. That's part of the force, but so is Obi-Wan Kenobi, right?
Oh, definitely. And the sooner, I would argue, the sooner a manager or leader can identify what those unspoken norms, politics are within an organization, the better, because that will
Mm-hmm.
allow them to move up. That will allow them to connect better, get their proposals met, have more influence and impact in their communication. And they're not something that's in the policies and procedures. This is something that for many it's taken advantage of, or it's there's no written protocol in place. And if you don't have those skills, even though you might be very intelligent, be a technical expert, maybe even have good people skills, which people skills I think would overlap with this, you
Yeah.
still are going to be at a disadvantage if you're not savvy in this way.
Yeah. And people all the time ask, well, how do I know what the unwritten rules are? I'm new in the company. That's why you want another political skill, high integrity, ethical political skill of building relationships. Someone in your network knows the rules, the unwritten rules. And sometimes, to your point, they're not written down. And in fact, they could be the opposite of what's the spoken and written rules. And so I want to know someone who does know them. I want to watch the behavior of people who are axed and people who rise, because that's a clue about the hidden culture. So it's about getting off of autopilot and opening my eyes and not viewing politics as so evil that I don't want to pay attention to it and that I take things too literally. Because there may be times where it's the opposite or a business problem comes, bubbles up from the unwritten rule. You know, we have an open door policy around here, or anyone that knows Joe knows his door ain't open in the morning, right? And at the end of the month, when there's finance time going on, do not bother him. So there are certain unwritten rules that a savvy person with political savvy will at least look around and ask the questions. What are the rules for meetings, for punctuality, for decision making, for channels communication? It's different in every organization, and it might be different in your pocket of the company versus what the rules are over here.
So critical to know, and something that I think people really need to take heed of, that even though you say you don't want to play politics, you don't want to get involved, you are in the game and you have to know how to navigate in the game that you're playing in and know the rules and be observant, be mindful of those. And like you said, when someone's coming in, maybe you can talk to those that are exiting or have been there a long time, pick their brain, let them give you that feedback that you need to say, okay, here's how decisions are made, or here's how policies are instituted. But it's understanding that, being mindful of it and making it a priority so that you
And
know the lay
yeah,
of the land as quickly as possible.
yeah, and I loved how you say it is a game. That doesn't mean that I'm an evil game player or manipulative. Because if I'm not playing a game that's going on in every company, right, then in every organization, otherwise check your pulse, then that makes me a bench sitter. As my teenage daughter used to say, "Oh, loser." So it's critical. And that starts with the mindset. I don't want to tell myself, oh, I'm a manipulative game player. No, I want to survive. And there is a survival of the fittest. And as the book says, the survival of the savvy. That's critical to study the rules, but also to study who really has power and who doesn't, because it might not be the person who's the title holder and the org chart. Because we're
Exactly.
living,
That's a very important distinction to make.
got to navigate the white space on the org chart. Who really has power? Who gets away with mistakes, right? Who really has the purse strings? Not that I'm going to kiss up to them, but I want to be aware of it.
The position that someone occupies doesn't indicate in all circumstances that they have the power. It could be
Yeah.
the admin assistant to that person that really controls the schedule of that person and
Yeah.
has and wields a lot more power than what you would think otherwise. So that's so critical to really point out and differentiate so that people don't think, well, they have this great title. They must be the person that has the power. No, they have the title. That's a
Mm-hmm.
different thing with them having the influence and the power. So such
Yeah.
a critical point to make. Love to talk about some of these skills. You have internal skills, you have external skills that you provide as part of your assessment. And I love how you break those down to give people a framework from which they can look at and say, here's my strengths, here's my weaknesses. Let's start with the internal skills that are really part of this organizational savvy. Are there any skills, maybe one or two of them, that you think would have a higher priority or they should start with if they're coming
Mhm.
into this new?
There's 13 skills on our cognitive framework, and people who are more or less political, over or under political, either excel or in trouble. And some of the skills we can use too much, which we can get into, Charles. But on the internal side of things, there's 5 of them. First off, I want to have integrity, personal integrity and performance integrity. You don't need to worry about that because you either have it or you don't. It's not really a skill, it's a character trait. That's the character cluster. Then there are 3 skills, and the other 3 internal skills are political awareness. The first one is savvy attitudes, being aware of your attitudes about politics. We've already worked on that in this podcast of shifting from a negative view exclusively to a more positive view. The second one is to study the politics and the unwritten rules. We talked about that one. And the third one is to understand, to think about this between the ears work, to give some thought to what is my corporate buzz? Or if I'm in a government agency, what's my agency buzz? What are people saying about me, my team? So, since we talked about 5 skills, I would say if I had to choose one, I need to change my attitude. But let's say that's happened. That's savvy attitudes to talk myself differently. But if you think of politics, it's the art of impression management. It's about changing perceptions. And I can't manage perceptions and change them until I first know, how are people perceiving me, right or wrong, fair or not. Knowing the corporate buzz is a key skill that we talk about a lot. We spend a lot of time in the workshop and in the book and on the assessment to figure out, what are people saying about me? Even if I don't hear it, can I figure out how to do it by asking other people, by making assumptions from people who have the same job as me? What are they saying about them? By looking at, how do people treat me? How they treat me is a clue in terms of what good and bad adjectives, the good, bad, and the ugly. If I'm never on a cross organizational team, I could just say, oh, they don't like me. No, think further. What images, or perceptions, or adjectives could be attached to your name? Maybe they don't see you as having the technical expertise. Maybe you don't play well in the sandbox. So, how people treat me is a clue, and I need to think about, what's that possible meaning of the negative phrases that are attached to my name, because it's going to decrease people's approval of my ideas. It depends on my image.
When I agree with you, having that self awareness is so critical that I think eludes some leaders. And it starts with really looking for it, being perceptive to it, being more mindful, not going on autopilot. But I have found the higher someone goes up in the corporate ladder, the less likely they're going to be given honest advice. So you can hire a professional coach,
Mm.
get the 360s, you can do other means, but it becomes more difficult to really get an honest assessment of where those areas are if you're higher up in those organizations. Yes, you can through performance reviews and through other things, but what advice would you give those as they're moving up to those higher echelons in the organization, yet they feel like something might be holding them back? They're maybe not
Yeah.
that self aware to know what it is, but they want to be able to ascertain what it is.
Yeah. I want to know what my buzz is, and people are afraid to speak truth to power, is what you're saying. Yes.
Right.
So, how can I figure it out if I'm afraid they're not telling me the truth? In fact, I have a name for that. It's called CEO disease. Have you ever heard of CEO disease, Charles? That's where someone who's in power, I say, and I've said this to people, Charles, you're probably not as smart, good looking, or funny as you think you are, because people are telling you what they think you want to hear, and they're not telling you what they're afraid you won't hear or don't want to. So that goes to corporate buzz. I've actually told CEOs they have CEO disease. So what if I want to ask a direct report or a peer, what's the buzz on me? I need to make it safe for them, is the answer to your question. Charles, we worked together a long time, and I know I have buzz, you have buzz. I'm trying to figure out, you never stop learning. I'm trying to figure out what's the buzz on me. So I'm asking other people what that might be. So I want to ask you. I know one of them is that I don't keep up to date with technical developments. That's why I depend on you guys, because I'm managing the boundaries and lobbying for budget. So I need you guys to keep me sharp on the technology. What else do you think the buzz might be on me? And I want to make sure that Charles, just because you tell me what it is doesn't mean that I think you're spreading that buzz. And it doesn't mean that I think you agree with the buzz. So would you be willing to share with me? You're my antenna. You're my eyes and ears. Would you be willing to share that with me? And I promise I won't be ticked off. I'll appreciate it. So I did about 4 or 5 things there to make it safe. Would that have helped you if you were that my employee, at least have a chance of feeling like you'll go into no man's land?
I think that's a great start. I think it also depends on the relationship you have with that employer prior to, because if you've nurtured and developed that relationship, there's that sense of trust, right? There's that
Yeah.
sense of psychological sense of safety there that they can state things that are contradictory or something that you may not like, yet it's safe for them to do so. So I think that's so critical to have that set up at the start, because then that conversation that you just delivered, which I thought was excellent, is going to have a lot more traction versus them thinking to themselves, well, I know what he's stating, but I'm
Mhm.
still scared because I know the culture. I know what he's been like in the past, and he's
Ah,
burned me on several occasions. So you
yeah.
still may not get that honest feedback. And that kind of goes on the other end of the spectrum to say for leaders, and I've heard this a lot of times with their colleagues, with the people that are working for them, it's nice for leaders to show more appreciation to their staff. No one has
Mhm.
ever said, I'm just too appreciated, and not tying it to recognition. And that's an important distinction because you're recognizing them for results, but you can appreciate someone for just who they are and
Yeah.
not necessarily tying it to anything that they have done, but reserving the recognition for something that really matters. Instead of what I feel in the society, we find a way to recognize everyone, regardless of what place they land in, just so that everyone feels like they have a ribbon, a prize, which I think is also hurting how the structure of society is right now with how we view it as competitive. And some people are going to win, some people are going to lose, and that's a harsh reality that I think people need to experience sooner rather than later.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about that. I was at a dinner the other night where we talked quite a bit about this issue of recognition from a parental standpoint. And some parents give their kids too little positive recognition, and it chips away at their self-esteem, and that becomes their script. And that happens with our employees are just kids with bigger feet, so that can happen. But the other end of the spectrum we talked about with my buddies the other night was in certain families and certain communities, there are sections of the country where privileged kids, all they get is positive and everyone has to win a blue ribbon. They never learn to cope with, if not failure, with growth and the need to grow. And so if I'm working for you, I don't want to live in a desert of positive communication, but I also don't want you just to look to give me positive feedback at the exclusion of being straight with me, what we call straight talk about my growth area. Can I go back to something you said before,
Sure.
Charles? You said you asked, how do I make it safe for people to tell me the truth about my image? But I think it's an even broader question of how do I make sure that people aren't telling me what I want to hear about anything about my decision?
Right.
Have you ever worked with someone, you state an idea and they said, oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. And they're even agreeing with you before you're done with it. They're overly accommodating to you. And even CEOs, the higher you go, people are going to BS you more and they're open. You might feel invulnerable, but you might be more vulnerable because you have the power. It's like Willie Sutton was asked, why do you rob the banks? That's where the money is. Well, why are people going to manipulate someone in power? Because that's where the power is. So, one quick tip for your listeners: if you are worried that someone in your group or the whole group is overly accommodating and just agreeing with you because you have the power. One technique that a brilliant manager that I used to work with, he at a big railroad you guys have heard of, he would state his opinion about a decision they're wrestling with. He'd wait, he'd hear the people that agree with him, and this, oh yeah, then he would wait a few minutes or the next day and say, you know what, hmm, the more I think about it, I actually want to reverse my decision. I think, and now look at who immediately, immediately agrees with you. That's what he would do. So now sometimes obviously it's because they're critical thinkers and they really modified their thinking with you, but sometimes it's just a knee-jerk reaction. So this is a good way to figure out. It's one of many ways to detect deception. People who are BSing you, and you better be careful.
That's a
So that's
great way
just
of doing it.
one of a few techniques.
No, I love that. I mean, I love how you can then identify who's giving you actually their advice versus just agreeing with you. And even in that decision making, group decision making, identifying a
Mm,
devil's advocate, someone to play that role, right? Always helps to build in more diversity of thought
yeah.
and hopefully avoid that groupthink as well. But it's so true that as you move up, it's harder and harder to get that honest feedback. If you've developed trust with that individual in which you're asking that feedback for, definitely beneficial and a great way to establish trust is recognize them and appreciate them. Not too much, not too little. It's kind of like the Goldilocks principle, right? Just the right amount
Mm,
so that you have those trusted advisors that's going to give you that honest feedback. So, so good. Let's move to the external skills of organizational savvy. You have some great ones in there, some proactive strategies and protective strategies. Let's first start with those proactive strategies. Give me one or two that you think would be a great jumping off point, or maybe one or two of the top ones.
yeah. Well, just in terms of the whole flow, as your listeners can think about and they can assess for themselves just by asking themselves, you know, your perception, the buzz. So the first proactive skills, managing perceptions, negative ones that can hurt you, essential networking for visibility, what we call balanced self promotion, which is making sure your handprint is on your work through elevator speeches and make in a non crass, non bragging way, putting your handprint on your work so people know your knowledge, your skills, and your results of you and your team, enhancing your power image so that people respect your power and take you seriously, not abusive power, but positive power, and ethical lobbying. That means selling your ideas. So, since I said before that of the internal ones, once you have your head in the right place about politics, knowing your corporate buzz is vital. Certainly, the ability to have techniques to manage negative perceptions. That's a vital one, is to manage negative perceptions. But in today's society, sometimes the most important one depends on your gender. This is a little passe, but not really. That the skill of balanced self promotion is the other one. And on our assessments, more than corporate buzz and managing perceptions, usually either handling sabotage or balance self promotion. People are overly modest, and some of this is gender based, and they don't positively talk about their results and their team's results. And besides having an elevator speech, can we think about a number of other tactics to make sure people understand what we do and the value that it has? Not just that I did it, but the strategic thinking and bottom line impact that went into that project or that process that I analyzed and reported on. So that would be my take. Of course, we got to do all of the skills, but in today's world, I do think that having especially with virtual world, we become invisible. I want to have people see me and know that I'm there and respect my competence so that at bonus time, promotion time, and at an idea approval time, that people are more likely to know, hey, this guy knows what he's talking about and he really delivers. What do you think?
No, that's good. And before we, in order to have time, I want to move to those protective strategies because I'd like to do a little deeper dive on both of those because I think those are both critical. Handling sabotage and detecting deception. You already gave me one strategy to detect deception, but sabotage. So it's more overt. It's how do you diffuse those personal attacks and challenges to your influence and power and do it in a savvy way. So critical to have, difficult skill to develop. Usually people don't develop them. They find out what works by trial and error. But in
Mhm.
some cases, more damage is done as a result because tempers get, emotions get high. and then communication breaks down.
Yeah. Well, first on, kudos to you for recognizing, even though we were talking about the internal skills of buzz, we came up with, you want to know that someone isn't BSing you. Really, that strategy I mentioned before about stating your opinion and then changing it and seeing who automatically comes with you. That's really a detecting deception technique, no different than someone is trashing someone else. You don't want to just accept these vague phrases. You want to say, well, tell me what you mean by that, and asking questions. I really want to understand what you're saying about Charles not being a team player. Can you give me some examples? Because if I need to talk to them about it, I want to have the data. They're BSing me and they're just trying to trash Charles behind his back. They will backpedal, or they're giving me some sound reasons and they're just sloppy with their language. He's not a team player. So detecting deception. In terms of sabotage, I would say two things are helpful to think about. One is when you're in a group, and the other is you suspect they're going to trash you behind your back. You got a favorite? Maybe we'll have time to hit both real quick.
Yeah, let's do behind your back.
Okay. I'm with you. I sense that you are an overly political person, and we didn't even talk about how you know when someone's over or under political. It's clear. I've seen you trash other people. You're a power tripper. You're a blowhard, and you tend to be aggressive. We get into it about any topic. Let's say the rentals account, how to handle that customer. You say to me, Rick, here you are, typical stick in the mud. You're a pigeonhole. I'm sorry, you're a roadblock. So maybe other people need to know just how rigid you are. Here we go again. You're going to go to my boss. The tactic for handling that kind of sabotage is to get there first. I'm going to get to my boss, not to trash you, but to let him know or her know, hey, Susan, you might be hearing from Charles today. He and I got into it yesterday, and I'm not here to lobby about the idea that, maybe we have a sit down and you make the call. But I don't think I was at my best, and I don't think he was at his best. Got a little heated. You might be hearing about it today. Now, when you go to Susan, I'm going to come off smelling like roses because you're going to lose your cool and be trashing me. So that's the technique versus if I didn't do it, I didn't get there first, not to trash you, but to give her the tip off that the sabotage might be coming. Susan calls me, Brandon, what's going on with you and Charles? No matter what I say, I look and sound what, Charles?
So you're at a
Offensive.
disadvantage. You're going to come across the right way, but how do you not look then like being a tattle, right? Where, okay, I'm going to go and run there to my boss to make sure he or she hears my side of the story first, because that could also backfire on you as well, right?
You bet. So I want to not be someone that's a chronic complainer or, have a broken wing. I'm very discerning. And remember what I said first, Charles. I only do this if you have a history and I've seen you do it. If I can predict that it's going to happen, you're right. I don't want to have a knee jerk response every time someone says something that I don't like or it gives me a possible clue. Are you a paranoid person? Or, you got to use your sniffer, but how often have you used your sniffer? This is about self-awareness and looking at yourself. Do you tend to be overly cynical of people so much that you can light up a room by leaving it? If you're pessimistic about people, then of course you better check your own tendencies. And of course, you may be the over political person trashing Charles when he didn't deserve it. So it's about self-awareness and ethics. Does that help at all with that?
That does.
Concern?
So, and there's some discretion involved there as well, right? Because if you know your supervisor well, if you've done this once or twice,
Mm.
then it's going to hold less and less power and influence for this individual to do that kind of behavior. So if you can nip it in the bud the first one or two times, going to your boss first, saying, we got into this discussion with my colleague today. We didn't agree. Here is my position. Not saying that he's going to come and talk to you later today, but just making them aware of your stance on it. I think that's effective. However, if it continues to happen at some point, there would hopefully be trust between you and your boss to know, okay, if so-and-so comes in after the 10th time, the 20th time, then they're not going to have the effect they're hoping to have. And hopefully that behavior will be
Right.
discontinued at some point, right?
Right. Although I want to pull back on one thing you said, because I wouldn't be being straight with you if I didn't say it. I love most of what you said and were aligned. The one thing that I didn't do in that little Susan demo is I didn't take my position and say, I want you to know how I feel. So that I said, remember I said, let's talk about the content and you make the call, we have a sit down. All I was talking about was telling her that she might be hearing from Charles because we had a disagreement. And notice I said, I wasn't at my best and he wasn't. I don't want to lobby my idea at that point because then I think I could be seen as taking an unfair advantage and lobbying and getting there first. That's just my point of view. But as you say, it depends on the relationship. It depends on my track record with my boss, your track record with my boss, and others as well.
Oh, no, and that's a great point to just really emphasize is that don't try to sell your point. Let he or she know of the discussion. Make sure you get there first, and then you're going to come out better on the other end than if you're seen as that as well.
That's not to say that I never go to my boss to sell a point. That's called the skill of ethical lobbying. But I do need to have a lot of skills for championing idea, for selling my ideas to stakeholders. And that's a key skill that we teach. How do you figure out the stakeholders who matters, who really have the power, like we were saying before? And how do we have a plan to go in that takes into account knowing their communication style, their political style, what their level of agreement might be even before I come to them. I try to suss that out. And then knowing what their agendas are, studying the politics and their powerful people's agendas, so I can hook my ideas to theirs with integrity. So that's about sabotage behind my back. Do we have time for a real quickie
Sure, we
on
can do a real quick one. If so you're in a meeting, right? And you're just caught off guard. Someone is directly and openly just sabotaging you, whether
Yeah.
they're judgmental, they're critical, they're slamming your practices, your policies, or assassinating your character. What do
Yeah.
you do in that case?
First thing I do is I paraphrase them because instead of pushing back immediately, you push me, I push back. That's automatic. It's reflexive. So I try to watch that and show empathy for what and paraphrase. Let me see what I understand. You don't think I have the credibility to be presenting to the group because I don't work for the company. And who am I to come from the outside on my track? And you said, you're darn right. So that paraphrasing gives me a few moments to think because I'm thinking, how the heck do I come back? And it also earns the respect of the entire group. I'm mature. By the way, not pulling a Will Smith and coming up and slapping you, right? And so I paraphrase for a number of reasons, and it might calm you down a little too when people feel hurt. Then I need to think about there's three things that can happen. You're doing a put down. A lot of people just push back with a put down. That loses respect for me. Other people put up with, right? They just, oh, sorry, well, so I don't get overly aggressive. I don't get overly passive with a put down or put up with. After I paraphrase, I put aside. I put it aside. I paraphrase it, and if it's not something that needs to be dealt with right then, I let it. Reasonable people could disagree, and I could understand. So I'm going to sometimes put it aside, and if that doesn't work, I can tell them at least what I can see as a merit, how I could understand how they might feel that way, and without the word "but." And I shift to my concerns and my disagreement. My concern about what you're saying is that doesn't take into account how I've studied other companies and I've brought the data and survey. So hopefully that data and survey brings credibility, as well as the fact that I've worked with 30 other groups within ABC Corporation. So paraphrase, decide I don't want to put down, I don't want to put up with. Can I put it aside and let's work it, especially if it's an irrelevant issue, which oftentimes the saboteur will do, and the group will appreciate me. If I do need to deal with it, I say what I can appreciate or even find merit in the idea, and I then state my concern or my disagreement.
Well, let me take it a step further then. So you paraphrase, which is great. You want to put it aside. Let's have this discussion at a later point in time between you and I, and we can discuss. Yet they won't let the issue go. And it's now sabotaging the meeting. It's a power struggle right now. The other members of the team are kind of looking down at their desks. How do you confront this individual in the right context so that you're not being negatively perceived, you're not losing control or showing too many emotions, but it's making a strong enough statement to say enough.
Well, there's a lot of tactics that we can do. The first thing I want to do, I said before, is I paraphrase to the individual. In this case, if you keep coming back and you say, yeah, and furthermore, Rick, thanks for hearing me. And I don't like your mother wears combat boots, whatever the next put down is. I'm not going to keep paraphrasing. Oh, so now what you're upset of? No, at that point, to stay in control, I cut off my eye contact. I don't paraphrase to you. I might hear what you're saying and look at you, but then I will turn to the group. So the issue before the group is blah, 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 blah. I will paraphrase to the group and answer it. If it happens again, there's a number of things I can do. I can state my concern about what you're doing right now and leave it up to the group. Does the group want to work this issue now? Or do you want to parking lot it? I'm happy to work this in the group now. It depends on the content, obviously. Or we can put it on the parking lot. I think the group will come up and discipline you for me. I'm going to name what I see. I see, Charles, I see a lot of people looking down and some are shuffling their feet. I can't help wondering what their reactions are and whether we should continue on this because this really wasn't part of the agenda. So I can let you know that I don't think the group wants to go there. Now, the caveat to that is obviously, if you're my boss and you are super powerful, then there are issues of balancing risk and reward, and that gets into political savvy too. Choices, 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 choices that go on here.
I love that strategy, putting it to the group, right? And noticing it, having the awareness of how are they reacting to this and having them do the discipline for you to get you back on track, which is a great strategy, especially for those that are not comfortable in confronting people in a public setting, but deflecting it to some extent so you get the help of others in the meeting.
And you can also deflect with humor at times, depending on the situation, not sarcastic humor because that's sideways anger. But I might be self-deprecating humor and just not do the pushback, not do the put up with, put it aside with humor at times or go to the group.
It's so critical because if you're not in the moment, if you're not aware, that default reaction, right? It's the cue, that trigger that leads you into that response. And then you not even realizing that you're in that mode until 10 seconds, 30 seconds later, until you catch yourself. So it's so critical. What you said at the beginning too is plan this out, have some foresight, practice these, identify situations in which that are common to you that this might come into play. So you have a game plan in place versus just being caught unexpected in this type of situation where you know your emotions are more than likely going to take over.
Bingo. That's emotional self-intelligence through self-awareness, self-regulation. And on the humor thing, don't you know when you're going to do a presentation what the likely resistances are? Not ones that are irrelevant and off the wall. That's the put aside. But the other ones that you can predict. If you're in sales, you have to pre-think what the resistances are and objections. I'll never forget the Oliver Wendell Holmes apparently was very short. He's a short person. And so he knew that this was an issue and guys would give him grief about it. So he's at a smoking study, a cigar smoking one time. And one of the guys says, "Oh, Dr. Holmes, I should think you feel rather small in these group of tall fellows." And he had seen this happen so many times. He turns to the guy without missing a beat. He says, "Yes, I feel rather like a dime amongst pennies." So, so do you have the comeback, not in a put down way, but in a fun, loving way and move on?
Great approach, great advice around that. As we near the end of this episode, I always like to ask you if there's one thing you could recommend to listeners to get them moving in the right direction to being more politically savvy.
I hate to say it, but it comes down to the same thing that comes down to with straight talk. It's getting my mind in the right place, like used to happen in the movie. I got to get your mind in the right place. The Southern prison guard Strother Martin said to Cool Hand Luke as he tortured the prisoner in the Southern prison camp. So I need to redefine politics as strategic influence and not throw the baby out with the bathwater to enter the arena of ethical influence. Otherwise, the game's going on and I'm not in it.
Some great stuff, Rick. Thank you again for being a part of our podcast. Remind everyone how they can get in contact with you.
You can learn more about political savvy at my website, www.brandonpartners.com. You can read about the book. You can see the courses that we offer on it. Feel free to ask me a question at rick@brandonpartners.com. If I'm not out of the country, I'll answer it within 48 hours.